So I'm Janelle Smith. I am the dietitian for the Celiac Disease Foundation, a national organization, and we're based in Los Angeles, California. So I will, in 15 minutes, tell you everything you need to know about the gluten-free diet. We're going to talk basically about the gluten-free diet, preventing cross-contact with gluten, what to do if you have continuing symptoms, and who should eat gluten-free. Did you see that Jimmy Kimmel bit asking people in Los Angeles what gluten is? They couldn't answer it. Essentially, it's the proteins, especially for those of us with celiac disease, that are in wheat, barley, and rye, and triticale. Have you ever seen triticale in your life? No, neither have I. These are the words that you need to look for in barley, because as Maureen will tell us, it's necessary for food labels to label wheat, but it's not compulsory. It's not mandatory that they label barley or rye. Rye is not usually seen under other names other than rye, but barley is a masquerader in these many malt forms. I'm going to try to break this down into 3 steps. Step 1, when you're trying to figure out if the food is gluten-free, is to look at if it has a label. If it says gluten-free, it might have any number of these symbols. How many of you look for a specific symbol on the product? Which one do you look for? The certified gluten-free. And anyone know what that means? It just sounds good, right? So there are a couple different certifications that test for compliance and make sure that the product is under 10 parts per million, which is more stringent than the FDA's definition. But just seeing the words gluten-free, whether it's in teeny tiny letters on the back, is actually just as good. A survey in 2015 and actually a more recent survey ending in 2016 found that 99% of products on the market labeled gluten-free, whether or not they have a certification, are compliant with that label. So far, our manufacturers are doing a good job. The medical advisory boards are saying that under 20 parts per million is adequate for most people with celiac disease. There's less than 1% of people with celiac disease who may need a more stringent diet, and that's something to really discuss with your health provider. This study in 2014, which was just after the gluten-free labeling law was put into place, found no difference in certification versus just the words gluten-free. In fact, the majority of products tested under 5 parts per million, even though they didn't have to test below 5 parts per million. So if you see a gluten-free label, you can trust it pretty well. I recommend to read the ingredients label just in case. There are mistakes that manufacturers make. I have found some, but I really feel more secure now with the gluten-free label. So step 2, if your product doesn't have a gluten-free label, or you're reading the ingredients because you're being thorough, what are we supposed to look for? Well, wheat has to be declared. So I remember when I got diagnosed, I tried to memorize all the different names for wheat, and gosh, is that quite a burden. Durum and triticale, camut, all that. If it's any one of those modifications, it has to say wheat somewhere on that label, such as under here, under the ingredients. So let's say this said camut, it must say contains wheat. The instances where you might want to learn the other names for wheat is when dining out in restaurants. Farro salad, soup with ancient grains. That's when you're going to really need to know what grains actually mean wheat. Like I said, barley, you need to look for malt extract, malt syrup, and malt flavor. Then we have rye, just rye. Brewer's yeast. Brewer's yeast is a product of fermenting beer, so it does have residue of barley in it. I don't see brewer's yeast in a lot of products. And then oats, if the product is not labeled gluten-free, because we know that commercial oats are highly contaminated with wheat and barley, so we should not be eating the oats from Starbucks. So what if these ingredients are in a product that is labeled gluten-free? If it's labeled gluten-free, it must still meet the FDA definition. So there are cases where a product will say contains wheat because it has wheat starch that has been modified to remove gluten, and it is still gluten-free. It is still safe for those with celiac disease. I'll go through that a little bit more. Otherwise, I have found some mistakes of malt in products that are labeled gluten-free, and I would avoid those. So here are the most commonly questioned ingredients that I get asked, and hopefully this relieves a little bit of the burden that you might be feeling after doing an internet search of what is gluten-free. Okay, so the first one is malted dextran. It sounds like malt. No, it's made from corn. Even if it was for some chance made from wheat or barley, it's so highly processed that it's always gluten-free. So avoid all the malts except for this one. Yeast extract. Remember I said brewer's yeast is definitely not gluten-free. Yeast extract technically could be processed from brewer's yeast. Most of the time it is gluten-free. There is a small chance it could come from brewer's yeast. So I prefer to see this in, to choose products labeled gluten-free when it has yeast extract. But if it's a product you like and happens not to be labeled gluten-free, but everything else in the ingredients is gluten-free, I would call that manufacturer and see what the source of their yeast extract is. Caramel color. This one's all over the internet. It is always gluten-free. Natural flavoring, almost always gluten-free. There's a small chance it could come from malt. So again, you could use the same rule as yeast extract. Artificial flavoring is always gluten-free though. Modified food starch. How many of you avoid this one? If you see it in a food that has an ingredients label or an allergen label, it has to say contains wheat if it comes from wheat. The only exception would be in USDA products, which are usually, your seasoned meats or your package of liquid eggs, as well as medications that may not have to follow the allergy disclosure, and Maureen will talk more about that. But essentially, if it doesn't say contains wheat, the modified food starch is usually tapioca or corn or potato. So like I said, wheat starch modified to remove gluten is allowed in gluten-free products, and it's been safely used in Europe for the past decade before we had our labeling law. But it should say wheat starch modified to remove gluten. Distilled vinegar and alcohol. This is always gluten-free, okay? So we do not need to worry about our mayonnaise made with white vinegar. We do need to worry about malt vinegar, but that's the only one. And then dextran. So dextran is usually gluten-free because it's usually made from corn in the United States. There is a small chance it could come from wheat, and that would be mostly in USDA products or medications. So if you're looking at medications and you see the word dextran, that's a good time to call the manufacturer and see what the source of the dextran is. So how much is too much gluten for the person with celiac disease and with gluten sensitivity, we believe? Just 1/8 of a teaspoon of wheat flour contains enough gluten to damage the villi of most people. I don't even have 1/8 teaspoon in my drawer. I don't know about you. It's too small. Okay, so next part of the diet. First we had label reading, and now we have cross-contact. And that's the word that the FDA uses rather than cross-contamination, if you're curious why I'm saying that. So because 1/8 of a teaspoon is enough to damage the intestines, a person may not have symptoms, but we do want to make sure that we're maintaining our health long term. We need to be sure to prepare things separately. I'd say the most important things to separate are things like toasters, sifters, colanders, baking supplies, with nooks and crannies, like maybe a whisk or something, a pastry cutter. Things that are a little bit difficult to clean and might have residue of flour on them. And then condiment jars, so no double dipping in the house. I really recommend just going to squeeze bottles for almost everything. Or labeling, this is the gluten-free jam, this is the regular jam. But it is okay to share other items that are thoroughly washed. So you don't need to get an entire new plate and silverware and pan pan set. When dining out, it's a little more complicated because we don't always see what's going on in the back of the kitchen. So it's definitely important to talk to our servers or managers when we're dining out. I do prefer places that have a gluten-free menu just because they tend to know what I'm talking about when I say what's gluten-free. But I do ask this question: how do you prevent cross-contact? Restaurants are regulated at the state level, and while they're supposed to follow the FDA definition of less than 20 parts per million, I don't know of a single restaurant that tests their product to make sure it's under 20 parts per million. So make sure that they have a separate fryer, pasta water, wok, toaster, steamer. Basically, I ask, how is the food prepared? And if I can tell that it's, I might ask, can that be prepared on a clean pan, in a clean pot, in a fresh pot? That's going to be the best chance for preventing cross-contamination. So a lot of places that say they have gluten-free menu will use the same toaster for their sandwich bread, or the same fryer for their French fries. And if you look at this deep fryer right here, all of this is flour. So I mean, that was something when I was first diagnosed, I thought, really? Can I really not have the tortilla chips at the Mexican restaurant? There is a pretty significant amount of flour that ends up just floating around in the fry oil. So questions that I ask to try to cut through all the 20 things that I could ask is, do you know what gluten is, and how do you prevent cross-contact? Usually if restaurants have any policies in place, they are happy to tell me. They want to tell me, oh yes, we have a separate this. And if they don't, they'll be pretty honest and say, yeah, it's all on the same equipment, and we really can't do anything differently. So should we all go gluten-free? Everyone here said no. I would agree. It's definitely a specialized diet to treat a medical condition. There are risks of being gluten-free in people who are undiagnosed with celiac disease. For one, it's very difficult to get an accurate diagnosis. So someone might think, oh, well, I just feel better when I don't eat gluten, so why do I need to know? And then 10 years down the road, they start having additional health problems, and they don't know if they have celiac disease or not. It's very difficult to get diagnosed at that point. So if someone is going on a gluten-free diet for other reasons, I try to get them screened for celiac disease beforehand. We also know that there's lower amounts of certain nutrients in gluten-free foods, such as iron, folate, B12, and zinc. So gluten-free is not healthier. It tends to have actually more fat content, sugar, and refined starches that are lacking the fiber and the outside of the whole grain that contains all the vitamins and minerals. So we're starting to see associations with weight gain or higher risk of type 2 diabetes, which is probably due to this and not anything about the gluten. But there are many people that will benefit from a gluten-free or gluten-reduced diet who do not have celiac disease. So I don't want to have a monopoly over the benefits of this. We're finding that a low FODMAP diet, so FODMAPs are fermentable fibers and carbohydrates that produce a lot of GI symptoms in people who have especially irritable bowel syndrome. And turns out wheat, barley, and rye are really high in FODMAPs. So this may be a reason why some people feel better eating less gluten, even if they don't have celiac disease. And especially for those who have IBS, we're finding actually IBD, like Crohn's and colitis, can benefit from this, endometriosis, and then other sorts of functional GI disorders. So when you have a really, like your GI tract moves differently, but there's not an inherent disease to any part of the GI tract. And then I have met quite a few people with wheat allergy who are pretty excited about the boom of gluten-free foods. They don't have to avoid rye or barley, but they have more options. And then those with non-celiac wheat sensitivity or gluten sensitivity really do have resolution of symptoms to the same degree of celiac disease on a gluten-free diet. What if I still don't feel well? How many in this room, I know we have some parents, would say that the gluten-free diet has not cured all symptoms? Yeah, the vast majority of patients are reporting that they still don't feel well after being on a gluten-free diet for years. And we're really looking into this, so there's a lot more research to come about this. Even we're seeing continued damage of the intestines on people who've been on gluten-free diets. The number one cause of continued symptoms is continued gluten intake. This is something that I think is important to do with a skilled dietitian, because a lot of physicians are not going to know the ins and outs of every single little ingredient, or take the time to ask all the layers of questions that are necessary. And in this case, I think it's important to tell your doctor or dietitian, yeah, I do cheat, or I accidentally, I ate the French fries in the shared fryer sometimes, or, it's important to be honest, because we can also help with those changes without making there be so much guilt or shame about that. Lactose and fructose intolerance are incredibly common in those with celiac disease. Lactose is found in dairy products, and fructose is found in mostly fruits. And so these usually both present with diarrhea, bloating, cramping, pretty quick onset. People usually know within an hour after they have an ice cream or a smoothie that their stomach did not agree with it, and those are pretty common causes. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is also thought to be somewhat common in celiac disease, and this condition can look like lactose and fructose intolerance, but to almost any food. So if you feel like, gosh, even the healthy foods, everything healthy, I feel awful after I eat it, that's a good reason to talk to your doctor. There's also pancreatic insufficiencies where you may have difficulty digesting fats, carbohydrates. Irritable bowel syndrome is a very common kind of dual diagnosis with celiac disease. I like to tell people we have a sensitive gut, and so it's going to present in many ways. And then there is a higher risk of IBD, such as Crohn's and colitis, in people with celiac disease. So your doctor's going to be really important in figuring this puzzle out. And then I did mention before, there's a very small fraction of the celiac population who may need a gluten contamination elimination diet. This essentially is for someone who continues to have elevated antibodies or intestinal damage despite going through a really thorough review with their dietitian. We essentially eliminate most processed foods and grains other than rice because there may be a very small amount of contamination in the food supply in general, which for most of us is adequate to keep us healthy as celiacs, but for some people it's not. So just a few resources that CDF has available for you. I have created several meal plans for pediatric kids, adults, those with diabetes that are available online, celiac.org/meal plan. We also have a healthcare provider directory. So if you need help finding someone in your area, you can put in your zip code and they'll let you know if there's anyone that's signed up. And then also if you recommend someone, encourage them to sign up. It's completely free for providers to add their listing here. And then we also have a marketplace where you can browse through lots of gluten-free products and realize, hey, it's not so bad.